This video is meant to be useful for the child and the loved ones of their child and the caretakers for their child where there's been a single sudden episode of violence or of victimization. We know that there are many children, unfortunately, who live in poverty or whose parents are abusive or not well informed about how to raise children. And we're not dealing so much with the chronic condition of abuse and neglect. In a way, we're dealing with populations in which an intervention can make a dramatic difference, because these are children who otherwise have the resources in the school, in the home. They're healthy to begin with. They're normal people, and they have suddenly faced a very abnormal event. And through the use of a video to be seen in the school and in the home, a way that brothers and sisters and parents can look at something and then talk it over, we're hoping that we can help.
PTSD is the disorder that occurs after a child has been exposed to a catastrophic event, and including things like natural disasters or violence or severe accidents. And the components of the disorder, in order for it to be qualified for the disorder, then the child must have experienced extreme helplessness or horror, fearfulness during the event. Now, there are then specific types of responses that children have to a catastrophic event, including symptoms of re-experiencing, symptoms of avoidance, and symptoms of arousal.
If you want to understand post-traumatic stress disorder and stress in children, I think it would be important to first understand how the body works. And as most people know, if the body is exposed to physical stress, like running 6 miles from a rabid dog, the body tries to balance itself. The stress is the exercise of running, and the body tries to balance itself by an increased breathing and an increase in heart rate. The mind is no different from the body. The mind makes adjustments to stress, to psychological stress. And so you see very similar kinds of adjustments being made mentally, the same way you see the body making adjustments physically. So every living thing does that. A child who runs 6 miles from a dog is going to have the same physical balancing as an adult that runs 6 miles from a dog. Similarly, an adult who's exposed to an extreme stress is going to try to rebalance themselves mentally, and a child is going to try to rebalance themselves mentally. The difference is that depending on how old the child is, they're going to have different abilities to balance. And so helping that child cope depends on their age. Helping that child cope depends on their previous experiences. Helping that child cope depends on the family and how the family copes with that stress. So it's different for different ages of children.
Children are more vulnerable and are less secure and have less power and status in our society anyway. And because of that, the additional trauma that they go through of being feeling helpless, of feeling unsafe after they've been through a traumatizing experience, can be more difficult for them to overcome.
Re-experiencing symptoms include things like the child is thinking about it all the time. The thoughts of the event are the child is going over in his or her mind thoughts about the event. Sometimes children are seeing images in their mind. They're seeing pictures in their mind about what happened. A man who had actually himself been traumatized because he lost 8 of his family members in the Guyana, the Jonestown massacre, was doing some fairly bizarre things. He was shooting at airplanes and things like that. And finally, one afternoon, he opened fire on a crowded elementary school playground. One little girl was shot, and the bullet entered through the side of her and went out the other side, taking lung and heart tissue with it. She didn't die immediately, and she did call for help. There was another man who was passing by. He was a young man, an adolescent who was passing by, and he was shot just completely open. And so there were children who witnessed each of those things. This slide shows, you can see here the little girl who, and she's calling for help. You can see the blood coming out the side of her, so that you know the child that drew this actually did witness this experience. And this is one of the sorts of things that popped back into his mind again and again. This next picture is one of a child who drowned. And you can see that it also represents the images that continue to pop back into the mind of the child who saw it. See how large the eyes are, and they're fixed and dilated. That was one of the hard things to see for people who witnessed this drowning. You also can see in this picture how the person has drawn the rescuers so very small because they were unable to help in any way. Another thing that happens for some children, but not all children, are bad dreams after a traumatic event. Now, little children often don't have the kind of dreams that older children have. They don't usually have a plot or as often have people in them. But we find to some extent one of the things that happens after traumatic experiences is a loss of innocence. And this is one of the realms where there can be a loss of innocence. All of a sudden you have children dreaming very specific dreams, the little children, with plots in them and somebody coming to do harm to them. For example, a child who had gone through a catastrophic treatment for cancer and had had a bone marrow transplant started to dream that cutters came and began to cut her up. Little children also often dream about monsters and danger and ghosts and things like that. Also, there may be dreams that are replications of the event itself, and yet on the other hand, there may be dreams that are simply dreams of danger to themselves or danger to the people that they care about. Now, some children will have dreams initially and then not have dreams afterwards. And a few children will even have night terrors in which they don't remember the dream the next morning. And in fact, they may walk in their sleep or do dramatic things in their sleep and just not even know about it the next day. For example, there was a little girl who was exposed to the sniper attack who she would sit up in her bed screaming, and then she'd run for the door and her family would have to stop her before she left the house. And she didn't remember any of it the next day. There's a little boy who had actually, when he was 18 months old, drowned and been revived. And then years later, he began to re-experience thoughts about that drowning when he was exposed to an earthquake. Now, this little boy would get up in the middle of the night after the earthquake, walk into his parents' room, and begin to talk to them about the drowning experience. And yet, he didn't remember any of it the next morning.
The second part of PTSD is almost the opposite. It's not having emotion, or not having the kind of life that you had before. Deliberately or unconsciously, you change something about yourself. You're numb. You don't do what you used to get gratification from. Children are so vulnerable to feeling ashamed and embarrassed. And often what the therapist is doing, who works with a child who's been traumatized, is they help that child overcome some embarrassment, some sense of strangeness. They help them eventually find their way back into the play group and into the school society. But that cannot be overstated. The child may suffer physical hurt and disability. They may have PTSD and that they're having nightmares. But the fact that they feel like less of a person can deny them self-esteem, can deny them the ability to grow as part of the team. It can really change their whole future if they don't overcome that shame.
Lots of large children stop going certain places. They just will not go, and parents can't get them to go. Sometimes parents forget the incident because they want to forget. We all want to forget. Everybody wants to forget what happened. And the child wants to forget too. But sometimes something as seemingly innocuous as going to a park for a nice Sunday afternoon ball game becomes an incredibly painful and anxiety-provoking experience for a child, who remembers what happened there.
Children experience symptoms of arousal including sleep disturbance, impairment to concentration, increased irritability, sometimes expressions of anger or aggression. One of the things we've been able to do is take a look at what happens to children in terms of their startle response, and we find that, for those of us, if we know a loud noise is going to happen, often enough we can inhibit our startle response to that loud noise. Sometimes after a traumatic experience, children lose their ability to inhibit that startle response. For example, when they hold up the flashcards and children shout out answers, some children startle after they've been traumatized. Or when they're in the auditorium at school and the microphone pops, that these children are startling. I worked with one child who, every time the clock ticked, she jumped because she was very traumatized and had an extreme startle response.
There's an inability of the central nervous system to modulate arousal. One of the wonderful things about how the central nervous system is made in the brain is that it controls arousal very well. If we get excited, upset, within minutes, the system quiets itself down. In children with post-traumatic stress disorder, that particular capacity becomes dysfunctional. Therefore, a child looks very hyperactive, hyper-alert, excited, and comes across looking very jittery and out of control. And naturally has an impact on people around the child in terms of his ability or her ability to interact with children of his or her own age and to be regarded as a peer.
In the first week or two following the traumatic experience, the initial first aid, and there's more than one psychological first aid, but the initial first aid has to do with giving the factual information, with normalizing children's responses, letting them know that all of their responses are normal following a traumatic experience. But without going into great detail, you're at that point in time making an attempt to both restore safety and restore a sense of safety.
I recall some years ago I treated a boy who had been traumatized at age 4, and I saw him at age 11. But the problems were just as fresh as it had happened yesterday. I think the child would have been a lot better off had he been seen at 4 or 5 as opposed to 11. When I saw him, he was in such rough shape in terms of his cognition and his ability to process emotions and so on, that he was diagnosed as having childhood schizophrenia. He was diagnosed as being learning disabled, being retarded, and an organic. I found out that he didn't have schizophrenia at all. He wasn't retarded at all, and so on and so forth. But there was a trauma that so devastated this child's capacity to integrate new information and to process information that he came across as being pretty withdrawn and retarded, when in fact he really wasn't. So trauma can do very devastating things to children when it's not picked up early and the proper intervention is made on behalf of the child.
The second wound or the second injury. It's the wound we give by asking people to tell the story and by responding to them with shock or horror or inappropriate timing. And what we do is we demean them and we damage them and we take away their respect. And there have been many people who have told me the second wound was worse than the first. They expected when they came to the hospital that they would be treated with dignity. And instead they were disrobed in a public place. Questions were asked that implied that they were at fault for being raped, or the job wasn't done well and evidence was lost. So all of us who work with victims, particularly vulnerable child victims, have to avoid inflicting a second wound.
It's also important to know in that initial phase, because it's going to be announced or that people will know something has happened and that children may be injured. So all of a sudden parents are rushing, if they're not with their children, they're rushing to the scene of the trauma. It's essential to know that when a child sees a parent looking frightened or horrified, that in fact may become a part of the traumatic imagery that replays itself in the child. Sometimes children, in fact, assess how horrible the experience was that they went through when they see the look on a parent's face. And so for that reason, we find that it's important for parents to have a moment to settle down before they approach their children. For example, after a tornado, the parents were moved into a specific room. They had a chance to talk briefly with a school psychologist and then were taken to their child so that, again, you didn't have that child exposed to that look of frantic horror.
The assessment, let's say, after a few weeks, the 5-year-old is wetting the bed and is clinging to mom and doesn't want to go to kindergarten. So that 5-year-old might come in and talk to Kathy Nader or some local child expert on trauma. And it's done in different ways. Often it's mom and child together for the first time, and then they might be separated. But the therapist in this assessment wants to find out if PTSD is the issue, if there are other things going on as well, what are the resources, what are the coping devices, and begin to get a sense of whether long-term treatment, short-term treatment, or just some reassurance is needed.
School teachers are often very helpful, and so I try to get all information I can from everyone that knows this child. I'm interested in those persons who knew the child before the incident, because I think it's important to get a sense as to how, because most often what adults will say is that this child has changed in very dramatic ways, very profound ways. A lot of times the change is really dramatic because a lot of times the children might have been exposed to earlier traumata and no one took note of it. Yeah, the child changed, but he was still okay. He wasn't acting out violently, he wasn't setting fires and really extreme kinds of behaviors that could be dangerous for people around him. But this time is different. This time he's much more irritable, nervous, cries a lot more, much more depressed and withdrawn, and has been doing a few things that adults may perceive as being highly unusual and even scary to the safety of other members of the family. So that's when the child comes in quite often. One of the things I do is go through a whole assessment of previous stressors, not only in the child, but also in members of the child's family, because stress does affect, in parents, does affect children. So I'd like to know, in terms of looking at the child's vulnerability, I'd like to know who else in the family had been exposed to car accidents or been to war or been traumatized in an unfortunate situation of rape and so on and so forth. So that's all part of the assessment process.
Some teenagers, you can establish rapport right away, just very quickly. And they just trust you because they know that you know and it's okay. Other teenagers, you know, regardless of who you are, they may never trust you because they've already been damaged. They've already been in a relationship where somebody has died or abandoned them or something bad has happened. And they're not quick to trust. And in fact, the more trustworthy you are and the more they want a relationship with you, the more it scares them away from establishing one. And they fight you and test you and do all kinds of stuff that makes it difficult. Younger children, depending on how you relate, depending on your relationship skills, depending on the chemistry between you and a younger kid. You know, there are a lot of different factors that go into it, but being is personable, gentle, warm, kind, honest, direct, reliable. Those things, I think, help the most.
This girl had been held hostage. She was captured with her father, and her father was murdered right in front of her. And the assailants kept threatening her repeatedly that they will kill her also. And she was held for a very long time, days at a time, maybe 4, 5, 6, maybe 6 days, just with a dead body, and with these threatening characters, threatening her every minute. You'll be next. You'll be next. And by the time I saw her, the incident had happened, perhaps at least 2 years or so. It happened, and she was having nightmares and dreams and the rage and hallucinating. Even though I could find no evidence that she was psychotic, but she would hallucinate the whole event, the sensation, the presence of her father. In fact, he's not there, but she feels he's there, and she's kneeling over him. Therapy with her was extremely rocky because of the loss and the way it happened. It was brutal. And the type of trauma and how it happens obviously has a lot to do with not only how the course that therapy will take, but also the difficulty in making any kind of progress. With her, it's extremely difficult because of the trust factor. It didn't matter whether it was a male or female therapist. It didn't matter at all. She just didn't want to budge and didn't want to trust anyone.
Brief therapy is aimed at helping the child to understand how the trauma impacts his life and forming some resolution toward his experience. We have regular meetings with teachers if it's in a school, regular meetings with parents, regular meetings with administrators. We begin to train a staff, if there's not already a trained staff, to do specific clinical interventions with traumatic response. We've already identified now which children need intervention. We begin to set up regular group interventions where it's appropriate, sometimes for grieving children, sometimes for parents whose children have been injured, sometimes for parents because their children are traumatized, parents whose children have died, and begin to have open lines of communication between the teachers and the clinicians so that the changes in the classroom are addressed as they evolve.
I think if you're doing brief with somebody who's just been traumatized, you can have a better, longer lasting impact than doing long term with somebody who got traumatized 20 years ago. Now that, it's not one-to-one like that, but it's just more opportunity sometimes.
And in short-term treatment, you're often trying to restore a sense of trust and security, to get the story told, perhaps to help see that child through the resolution of a few symptoms. So if there's been bedwetting, it's not a shameful thing, and the bedwetting will often clear up. If there are nightmares, they're talked about, and there'll be some reassurance, and often those clear up rather quickly. But depending on what happened, there may be some longer-term issues. Let's say it's a really bad event. A teacher was killed in front of a class, and there are children who don't want to go back to that class. Brief therapy might help several children feel comfortable in the school, but one or two might not be ready in a month. And then that might lead to longer-term treatment.
Children who are severely traumatized often need long-term treatment, and especially if there are complicating factors from the child's previous life experience, long-term treatment may be indicated. When that happens, you're not only dealing with the specific aspects of the child's traumatic experience, but you're also dealing with personality issues and developmental issues as they begin to become intertwined with issues of the trauma.
You have to be aware that PTSD, by definition, comes back. It isn't a steady state, but there will invariably be anniversary reactions, reminders, and suddenly a person will feel all those feelings again. If they haven't been warned about this, they can think they've gone right back to zero. And I find often my job is to buoy up someone who's been demoralized and even to say something. Do you think PTSD is trivial? And when you give this entity its respect for the power that it has, I think people can deal with themselves better.
Now, the last stage, the longer-term treatment, it's really important to understand that treatment might not be continuous, it might be sequential. And by that, I mean that as a child goes through the next developmental stage or reaches a major developmental task and accomplishes it, they will have new life experience, a new way of thinking. Their ability to understand their world will completely change as they mature. And at those times, they will need to revisit the experience that they went through, the traumatic experience, to reintegrate it and reprocess it into their memories and into their life.
It can be metaphorical and usually is. Every once in a while, it is literally revisiting. And the ultimate in overcoming a fear that has become a phobia, so that